Okay, Boker Tov. We're moving to the next beracha of the Amida. Yesterday we did the beracha of judges, asking Hashem to return to us our court systems, our central Supreme Court, our Bet Din, but also our leaders who will judge us with righteousness and justice, and will put in a socially moral, standing within our communities. We now move to the next beracha, which this beracha, it's well documented, it was not part of the original Amida that the rabbis had composed. The original Amida was known as Shemone Esrei. Shemone Esrei literally means 18. It's because the rabbis had originally composed 18 blessings, 18 berachot. 3 to open the Amida, 3 to end the Amida, and 12 requests in the middle, a total of 18 berachot. Later on in history, and we'll document the history of it, the rabbis added a 19th beracha, which is the beracha that we're going to do today, the beracha of laminim v'lamalshinim, the beracha which talks about the heretics, the slanderers, and the factions that were created amongst the Jewish people during the Second Temple period that the rabbis wanted to get rid of, that were causing a lot of problems to mainstream Orthodox traditional Judaism. We'll read the beracha and translate it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about its origins and what we should be thinking when we're reciting this beracha. Laminim v'lamalshinim al tihi tikva. Minim are heretics, people who veer off of the traditional way of looking at the religion, but they have foundational problematic beliefs. Things like not believing in God, not believing in God's divine intervention, not believing in reward and punishment. Basic fundamental principles they reject. That's called heresy. So to the laminim, to the minim, to the heretics, vela malshinim, and to the slanderers. Malshinim comes from the root word lashon. Lashon means tongue or speech. That in many situations there were factions of Jews who would slander the rabbis, who would report them to the government. That's why some people add in the word velam mosrim, those who gave people over to the government, which was usually in the case of financial presentation. So for example, if a Jew had a lot of money, the goyim, he tried to hide that and conceal that because the governments of the goyim would try to confiscate their wealth. And so another Jew who wanted to get at his neighbor could report him to the government, and the government can fine him, take away his money, or potentially kill him. So that's called Mosrim. Yeah, mostly Second Temple period under heavy Roman rule. The beracha itself seems to be a response to the disciples of Yeshu who started to splinter off of mainstream Judaism. And at the time, it was hard to distinguish between a Jew who was a follower of Yeshu versus a Jew who was a mainstream Orthodox follower of the rabbis. Because at first, they didn't call themselves Christians, they didn't call themselves different factions, they identified themselves as a Jew, much like Yeshu himself did, but they started to believe in his ways of thinking about rejecting oral tradition and Torah Shebaal Peh and some other fundamental principles of Judaism, but they did that sort of in private so that these people could enjoy from community life while still maintaining their sectarian beliefs in accordance with Yeshu, their teacher. So this started to become a major problem for the rabbis. That's why they instituted this beracha in the very beginning. There was also the problems that they had with the Sadducees and the Qumran and other sects of Jews that started to deny oral tradition and started to do very strange things from Orthodox mainstream traditional Judaism. So this beracha encompasses all of them. And for us today, it would encompass people who have other heretical beliefs, such as Reform Judaism and things like that. So to those heretics, to the slanderers, to those who reported us to the government, al tihi tikva, let there not be any hope of continuity for them. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a revolt against the Romans, right? It's possible that during that time period, there were many Jews who tried to find favor in the Roman government's eyes and would therefore report on rebellious activity or things of that nature. That was going on consistently, But this beracha really traces more to Second Temple period. The Bar Kokhba rebellion is about 70 years or so after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. So, I mean, this beracha could then be applied in many different situations, but it does not seem that that was the original motivation for penning this blessing. V'chol hazedim kerega yobedu, and let all of the wicked perish in an instant. V'chol oivecha v'chol soneecha mehera yikaretu, all of your enemies and all of your haters, let they be speedily cut down. Umalchut harisha'a mehera te'aker uchaber, and make the evil, wicked monarchy, kingdom, let it speedily be uprooted and broken. Utchalem v'tachni'em b'mehera b'yamenu, and wipe them out and humble them speedily in our days. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you God, shover oyevim umachnia minim, who destroys the enemies, breaks the enemies, and subdues the heretics. Some people put zedim at the end of it. Yeah.
This is against the reform. You're wishing the reform die and get killed.
So it's a good point, right? I think that it's a good. The whole beracha is a very troublesome beracha for a Jewish mindset, because I mean, and you can understand why this wasn't originally entered into. Judaism is a peace-loving religion. It's we want people to do teshubah. We want people to have a good way of thinking. We don't generally pray for the demise and death and destruction of people. However, when push comes to shove and evil is being spread throughout the world, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Jews. Like I said the Reform Judaism, but on jihad and on types of mass killings and on genocide and on people who bring tyranny to the world, you could apply this beracha onto them as well. What I think the proper mode, let's say, for something like Reform Judaism would be, is probably at first to take the approach of Rabbi Meir. There's a very famous, actually, Bruria, his wife. There's a very famous story in the Gemara Masechet Berachot about a heretic who was bothering and antagonizing a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was a disciple of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he was part of the after destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He was, in the year like 130, 140, 150 type era. So Rabbi Meir was getting bothered by this heretic. Yes, and he was starting to get bothered by this heretic, and he started to pray to Hashem to kill this guy, to destroy him. And his wife Bruria told him, don't pray for his destruction. Pray for him to do teshubah. She said the pasuk says yitamu hatta'im min haaretz, which literally means let the sinners be destroyed from the world. But Bruria wanted to read it differently. She said it doesn't say yitamu hotim. It doesn't say let the sinners be destroyed. It says yitamu hatta'im, let the sins be destroyed. In other words, her perspective to her husband was pray first for his sins to go away. Let his way of thinking be destroyed, but let him be able to see the light and have clarity and come back to the proper way of thinking. That being said, in the end of the day, some people are so set and stuck in their ways where they're not going to move off of that, and they're going to continue to perpetuate false narratives, false beliefs, and poor, corrupt ideologies. So in the end of the day, yes, Judaism says those people need to be removed. Unfortunately, it's not something that we are happy about. It's not something that we relish or want to see happen. But yes, the world needs to be rid of evil. And when evil goes away and is destroyed, it's something that we want to see happen in this world, because we want the world to be brought back to righteousness and justice. So, for example, when the Egyptians were drowned in the Red Sea, we were able to sing a song. We don't sing a song because we're happy that they died, but yes, corruption and tyranny was destroyed from the world. And that is a positive thing for the world. When monarchs fall and dictators fall, those are positive things for the world. There are times not to rejoice that it had to happen that way. We don't like that it had to happen that way. But in the end of the day, when evil is removed from the world, that's part of our mandate. It's part of what we as Jewish people want to do, is change the world's way of thinking and get everybody onto a moral type. So I think the rabbis recognized that there were too many different factions, there were too many corrupt ideologies that were swaying people in the wrong directions, and there was a need to have people to have those ideologies harshly removed, and to say that as a critical part of what we need in order for our children to grow up in the proper way, without having those corrupt ideologies pushed on them, I think is very important.
Rabbi,
yeah.
doing teshuvah? Like, when do you, like?
If a person is on the pathway to teshuvah, if a person...
No, they're not. Let's just say.
So we always want to pray. I think when you're praying this beracha, a person should have in mind that story of Rabbi Meir and Bruria to say that the hope is that clarity comes to the world where people can recognize the error of their ways and their wrong way of thinking to hopefully go ahead and do teshuvah. But there sometimes comes a point when teshuvah is hopeless for certain individuals, right? Where, I mean, whatever, everybody has free will, and those individuals have the ability to change. But in practicality, as an outsider, you're looking around and you're saying, the odds of these things changing, given the environment, given the way the world is going, the trending of the world is not happening towards that. So we need Hashem to insert himself in clear ways to allow those corrupt ideologies to be destroyed, and those people who are carrying them that are refusing to give them up to be destroyed as well.
You're born into that family, you never,
Right.
you're born, and your father, and that's what they taught you.
So there's a concept of, you're talking about a Jewish person who's born that way or anybody?
You're born that,
They don't know better.
they don't know better.
Well, I guess it depends on what we're talking about, right? So, I mean, you're right. Certain cases, if people are born that way, they don't know better. So we hope that Hashem finds ways, maybe in a more gentle touch, to get them to drop their ideologies and find a way back to what the proper way of thinking is. Even for Goyim, it doesn't mean that they have to become Jewish. It just means that they have to keep Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, be good people, add to society, not be violent, things of that nature. I think when it comes to Jews, we have a concept of what's called Tinok Shenishpa, a child who was captive. In other words, a child who's born into an environment where, what are they going to do? What's...
Like the Muslims, they have this mitzvah, they teach them how to be, to kill people, and
So there's a certain point where I would say you're right, but I think that Hashem embeds every human being with a certain level of humanity that they have the right to call, they have the ability to have free will to call that out. Now, does that mean that it's easy to do that when a person is indoctrinated and brainwashed from a young age? How much can we hold them accountable for that? I think that there is always a level of accountability that we can hold for them, and if not them, then their parents. So the whole ideology is corrupt. They all have to be destroyed. If anything, that's what I'm saying. You're right in the end of the day, but I can't allow people who are indoctrinated with harming and bringing terrorism to the world to continue to exist. I ask Hashem to remove them in whatever way he deems fit. It's worth noting that when the Gemara describes the history of this beracha, it says that the leader of the Jewish people at the time was a man named Rabban Gamliel. And Rabban Gamliel is a very famous Tana. He was known for being very, very tough. And when he wanted to make this beracha, he felt it was not appropriate for him to be the one to make the beracha. Maybe people would look at it as a vengeful thing, as a spiteful thing. He said, I'm not capable of writing such a beracha. He actually opened it up to the rabbis. He says, who is capable of writing such a beracha? And none of the rabbis jumped up. They ended up appointing a man by the name of Shemuel HaKatan. Shemuel HaKatan wasn't because he was small, he was humble. Didn't even go by the name rabbi. And they appointed him to write the beracha. Rav Kook points out, why was he the right person to write the beracha? If you look in Pirkei Avot, in chapter 4, it says that Shemuel HaKatan's motto was the pasuk binful oyivcha al tismach. In the downfall of your enemy, do not rejoice. That was his motto. So the rabbi said, here is the perfect person to write this beracha, an unemotional detachment from it. In other words, anybody who was to write this beracha, it could potentially come off as they are rejoicing or happy, or I don't know what the right word is, like they were reveling. That's the great word. They're reveling in the downfall of others. So by appointing a man so humble as Shemuel HaKatan, whose motto was, do not revel in the downfall of your enemy, it would be guaranteed that this beracha was not written with that type of an approach, with this idea that we want everybody to be destroyed, but rather, if God sees fit and it's in God's eyes to do so, so as to allow the rest of society and the world to exist on a path that is appropriate, so be it. That's up to God. We don't say this beracha so that we want to be able to rejoice in the downfall of other people, but sometimes that does need to be what it is. So I think it's noteworthy that Shemuel HaKatan, such a humble person with that motto, wrote this beracha, which basically infused in it the idea that every time a Jew says it for millennia after that, it should be said in a way with that intention in mind. Not that we should revel, but that we should just pray for the lack of evil to be in the world, that Hashem should remove evil from the world. So I think that's very appropriate. Just the backstory on Shmuel HaKatan's humility. There's a story that's told about how when the rabbis went, before we had a set calendar, used to meet together every year to determine whether a year was meant to be a leap year or not, based on the conditions within the seasons and how the calendar fell out. So they would meet yearly to determine whether they should add a month or whether the conditions were right to just go with a regular year. They would do this year to year. So you wouldn't know all the time when a year was a leap year the way we know now with a set calendar. So to do this, they had to meet together, 23 judges, an odd number, in order to determine whether it should be made a leap year. So Rabban Gamliel, who was the leader at the time, sent out invitations to the 23 rabbis who should attend. And when they got there were 24. One extra rabbi came, somebody showed up without an invite. And Rabban Gamliel got very angry. He said, you can't have it. Who showed up here without an invite? And Shmuel HaKatan left. Shmuel HaKatan got up and he left. Now he had an invite, but he did not want the person who did not have the invite to get embarrassed in public that he had showed up without the invite. So Shmuel HaKatan took it upon himself to leave and not embarrass the other individual. That's the type of person that a Shmuel HaKatan was, looking out for the well-being of other people, and his humility was unparalleled and unquestioned. And that's the type of approach and characteristic that was necessary to write such a beracha. And so I think that that's important to keep in mind when we're reciting this beracha, not in the idea of reveling, but in the idea that we want to see a world that is free of hate, of violence, of crime, of corrupt ideologies, and to hopefully bring certain clarity to the world in whatever way God deems fit. Unfortunately, sometimes that means destroying certain people and certain sects and groups. Other times we would hope that the clarity would allow them to come of their own volition, whatever God sees fit and whatever those people are capable of doing. That's what we should go ahead and pray for. It's noteworthy that this comes after the idea of judges, because after we talked about judges bringing righteousness, it's also incumbent upon us to understand that judges are only limited in what they're able to do, right? They're only so capable of weeding out all of the corrupt ideologies. Sometimes we need Hashem to enter himself into the picture and to take matters into his own hands. But the point of these last two berachot is to create a society that is moral, that is equal, that is fair, and that operates under righteousness and justice without those evil and heretical ideologies infiltrating our systems. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.